Hey, welcome back. Like I've said many times on this channel, current Nintendo Switch emulation is cursed, a curse that started the moment the devs behind the late Suyu left us. Yuzu's code is cursed, toxic, and honestly nobody should even touch it. Since then, tons of emulators have popped up, and almost none of them made it past the curse of the first year. Today we're going to talk about some of the projects that came and went during that time. But before that, a quick favor to ask you guys. The channel is about to lose our sponsor, and that's about 30% of our monthly revenue right now. So if you want to save money buying games and help the channel out at the same time, consider grabbing a game through the link below. If you want to buy original games while saving a lot, check out Instant Gaming, the digital store that sells games for various platforms, such as PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo Switch. Get games of all genres with discounts of up to 95%. You'll also find a variety of gift cards and credits for other services. You can pay for your order through your credit card on a website with a 4.7 rating on Trustpilot. You're buying games directly from Instant Gaming, not from other retailers. If you encounter any issues, Instant Gaming offers 24/7 support. What are you waiting for to save? Links in the description. And if you're into this kind of informative video, drop a like, and if this is your first time on the channel, consider subscribing or leaving a comment. It really helps a lot with the content. This video is gonna be a long one, so grab a snack and let's dive into this trip down memory lane. This video wouldn't even exist if it weren't for the original emulators. They were doing an amazing job, but unfortunately they're not with us anymore. Let's talk about them real quick, Yuzu and Ryujinx. Let's start with Yuzu. Despite all the controversies around the project, like that whole thing about stealing part of Ryujinx's code, for those who don't remember, this was pretty recent stuff. Whenever a new release dropped, Ryujinx was always the first emulator to run the game or fix it, and in less than a week Yuzu already had the game running, almost always thanks to fixes that already existed in Ryujinx. The thing is, credit wasn't always properly given, and that's where a good chunk of the drama that's followed Switch emulation from the start actually began. Another thing I need to mention is that Yuzu's code was entirely built on top of a dev kit that was illegally obtained by the original team, something that only got revealed later on by the Suyu team. The emulator was constantly called out by Nintendo for promoting piracy, especially around Tears of the Kingdom, something that supposedly happened, but I can't confirm it, even though there were plenty of accusations floating around on Reddit. Yuzu was a great emulator, the team worked in a fast and optimized way, and it had everything it needed to be the best emulator we'd have to this day. That is, until Nintendo decided to go straight after the project and filed a massive lawsuit. At first, a lot of people thought the Yuzu team would be like Arcade Hero, because a big part of emulator legislation would finally become clearer if they took Nintendo to court and won, and they actually said they were going to fight it. Unfortunately, about 2 days after that announcement, the project was done, taking Citron down with it too. Even though Citron wasn't even breaking any laws, it just happened to be part of the same company. The result, they reached a legal settlement where Nintendo forced the devs to never work on any other emulation project again. They had to take Yuzu and Citron offline immediately, websites, social media, Discord, everything, and they still had to pay out a huge amount of money for copyright infringement. And that's how we lost one of our main emulators, still packed with new features that never even got the chance to be released. Chronologically, Ryujinx wasn't actually the second one to shut down, but it also suffered at Nintendo's hands, just a bit later. In theory it should have been an untouchable emulator, mainly because its lead developer was Brazilian, and in Brazil developing emulator software isn't considered piracy. Piracy would only be selling pirated content, and Ryujinx never did that. After Yuzu's end, Ryujinx started trimming down its changelogs, because the person writing them was busy, not because they were trying to keep a low profile with Nintendo like a lot of people believed. But then, one day, Ryujinx also got hit with a cease and desist from Nintendo. Some say the Brazilian dev took a payout from Nintendo to abandon the project and disappear, others think he simply had no choice. And based on what actually happened, he really didn't have a choice, just like I always believed. That was the end of the project as we knew it, but its successor actually did a better job. That extreme accuracy philosophy got pushed aside. The emulator gained some welcome performance improvements, and in a lot of cases the result ended up surpassing Yuzu and its forks. Now that the two main projects are dead, let's try to walk through the life and death of the other projects, in chronological order. The first Nintendo Switch emulator for Android always sounded like something revolutionary. Skyline, even though it never really evolved enough, was the hope for anyone who only had an Android device and wanted to play their favorite Switch games. Since it was built completely from scratch, meaning it wasn't a port of any existing PC emulator, its compatibility list was totally different, and to this day some games actually run better on Skyline than on Eden for Android, even if it's just a small improvement. But with the looming threat of a Nintendo lawsuit, the project was taken down and fully discontinued. A lot of people called that cowardice back then, but today, seeing what happened to Yuzu and Ryujinx, it was clearly a concern that couldn't be ignored. But out of that came the fork we'll talk about later, Strato, which to this day has never seen the light of day and probably never will. After Yuzu's shutdown, a bunch of meme emulators popped up, and one of them had a short life but still deserves a mention, Suyu. It kind of started as a joke. The project lead didn't even know much about programming or emulator development, but he quickly managed to pull together a team of devs. Suyu ended up releasing 3 versions and implemented some pretty unique stuff. Throughout its life, the Yuzu team had always planned to add a home menu for preserving the Switch's own operating system too, and Suyu was the first emulator to enable that feature, still pretty rough at the time. Today most emulators already have that, and almost nobody bothers using it, because it's way easier to just double-click a game and launch it, without wasting extra RAM on systems nobody's going to use. It was actually the Suyu devs, like I said, who discovered Yuzu's cursed code, and they warned back then that this code was toxic and nobody should touch it. They even claimed they'd found traces suggesting an illegally obtained dev kit had heavily helped Yuzu with its reverse engineering process. Things started falling apart when Suyu grabbed some fixes originally made by Sudachi, and whoever was responsible refused to give credit on purpose. The devs working on the project combined that with the leader's immaturity up to that point, and just abandoned ship, exposing everything that had happened and leaving the project behind. After the announcement, the lead dev even posted a new version to make it look like the project wasn't over. But by that point, with no devs left, it was already done. One of the most promising emulators we had was Sudachi. Here we had an experienced dev who played a key role in Switch emulation, fixing and implementing all kinds of stuff. Sudachi's development was one of the last ones that kept bringing new stuff in pretty much every version, even if it sometimes took months between releases. But it didn't take long for things to start going downhill. Just like Suyu had issues taking code without giving proper credit, the Sudachi dev accused Uzuy, which we'll talk about next, of stealing his entire codebase, even though the APK was about 50% smaller, and its devs had taken completely different paths. Later on, the Sudachi dev made an accusation that led a bunch of people connected to Uzuy to launch an unnecessary attack against him, and that's where all the drama you're going to see a lot more of from here on started. He never showed anything solid to back up the accusation, so it all stayed pretty much up in the air. The dev then stepped away from the scene, tried making a Citron-based emulator, which was bad and had a huge performance gap compared to what already existed, and eventually moved on to developing emulators for iPhone, where he could actually make money off it. We haven't heard from him in the Switch emulation scene since. Uzuy was next on the list. It was an emulator based on Yuzu NC, but overall it already had better performance and less heating on the device. The project's ideas were good, like the FSR implementation, which helped visually, and there was also, still in a rough state, cycle skipping and even the early idea of using frame generation. The problem was the project never had time to properly work on all of that. About Uzuy's controversies, first, the emulator had closed source code, but after a lot of pressure from the community it eventually went open source. Like I mentioned, it got accused by Sudachi of being an almost exact clone, with screenshots of the code in Android Studio, but at the time it felt like people were only paying attention to how Uzuy performed compared to Sudachi, and nobody was really looking into where the code actually came from, which is still a touchy subject to this day with no clear answer. Phoenix was accused by the community of being harsh with users, and ended up having to change identity, which is how Citron was born and Uzuy got discontinued. And that's how Citron was born, founded by Phoenix, now going by the nickname Zephyron, with a fresh reputation and, of course, new problems. It was a revolutionary emulator for its time. Those ideas of frame skipping and frame generation that had first shown up in Uzuy were finally put into practice. Citron was the first emulator to have a frame generator that actually worked, even though it only ran at full capacity on Snapdragon Elite, but the results were impressive. Frame skipping existed too, but it didn't hurt performance nearly as much. FSR2 was also implemented, and even though it didn't change performance much, it gave a slightly better visual than FSR1. A bunch of Unreal Engine games got improvements, some of which came from Torzu, which we'll talk about later. Unlike Uzuy, Citron also ended up getting a Windows version and a barely functional Linux version. I'm not totally sure it was ever fully ported to Linux before the project ended. It was also one of the first emulators to support firmware's PAS 19, which allowed running game updates released after the Switch 2, sometimes with performance gains, like a 10% boost in Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, plus extra content in some games and new language options, thanks to a partnership between Ryubing and Citron. Trouble started with a possible DRM feature that would block users from running their games, but that got exposed and scrapped. Then came the Switch verification ban wave. If you didn't have a Switch verified through a third-party app, you got banned from the Discord, and that's exactly what happened, with close to 20,000 people getting furious. That opened the door for a former Citron developer, who'd already left the project, to go public with an expose. Back then a huge fight broke out. Everyone turned against Zephyron, who was already on shaky ground with the community, and the rest is history. That whole Citron implosion is still controversial. Back then I was against Zephyron too, but today I see it differently. Not everything that was said back then was actually true, and over time a lot of that story fell apart, but that's a topic for another video. Everyone thought that was the final nail in Citron's coffin, but the team came back after a while. Zephyron never actually stopped working on the project, even though no master builds had come out since, and with that comeback they brought the proper implementation of the new firmware updates. But after some time, with a Nintendo DMCA hitting several projects, along with the supposed expose about Zephyron, he stepped away and hasn't actively returned to Switch emulation since. The old Citron turned into Citron Neo, which is still active today with a different dev team. Along with Citron, Ryubing also got hit by Nintendo's DMCA and had its original project shut down, but it's still active today with a different team. Let's talk a bit about it. After Ryujinx ended, 3 new forks showed up that nobody really talks about anymore and didn't add much, so I won't get into those here. Ryubing wasn't meant to revolutionize Ryujinx, but that ended up happening anyway, and it actually reached higher performance than the original fork. Even with the new team having little initial knowledge of the project, they managed to improve a lot. They cut down memory usage, fixed leaks, and implemented new stubs. It even beat the performance of emulators like Citron and Eden in some games. The fork kept evolving while accuracy stayed a priority too. So what went wrong? First off, not everyone was a fan of the lead dev's lack of manners. He was the type of guy who wouldn't let anything slide and always blamed the community, even for persistent questions. I get that can be annoying, but there's a limit. His Discord also had Switch verification set up, and bans were shared with Citron, meaning if you got banned from Citron's Discord, you could also get banned on Ryubing, even though that wasn't always a hard rule. The real breaking point was the DMCA. As far as I know, the lead dev still contributes a bit to whatever's left of Ryubing, but keeps a low profile these days. Torzu was an emulator that vanished from the scene and was also really promising, one of the forks that showed up right after the original Yuzu shut down. It was one of the first to improve Unreal Engine compatibility, right when Shadow Generations launched, a game that up to that point didn't run on any other emulator. Very early in development, the dev decided to leave the surface web and started hosting and distributing the emulator on the dark web, and that ended up being, to this day, the only approach that's actually worked as a real guaranteed method against Nintendo. I actually had some contact with the dev for a short period, back when he wanted to shift things a bit and give the emulator more visibility on the surface web. Unfortunately, communication got cut off because I couldn't reply in time. There were people mirroring the releases on the surface web for a while, but eventually they stopped posting updates. Today, it looks like the project isn't getting anything new anymore, just a Reddit post with the last release, published about 4 to 6 months ago. Now let's talk about a trio of emulators that don't even deserve space in this video: Nyushu, Nuzu, and Zyunx. Basically, all of these mobile emulators are fraudulent clones of other projects. At first they cloned Uzuy, then moved on to cloning Citron, and eventually Eden. A lot of the time they don't even bother changing some of the data, so you'll literally see Eden written somewhere or the name of whatever original emulator they're cloning. Their website is the shadiest part of it all, listing features that never even existed, like save states and claims of having the biggest compatibility list around. If you use any of these projects, you're genuinely at risk of having your data leaked, because we never really know what's actually been added or modified inside the app. I do not recommend these at all. Sumi was the most recent case to show up, and shortly after, it literally disappeared too. I actually made a video about this emulator when it launched. Its performance was even better than Eden's. Some people said it was just some kind of FPS counter trick, because even when it showed over 60 FPS on screen, the image sometimes looked kind of choppy. Either way, for whatever reason, it had better performance on both Windows and Android, but only a small part of the community actually paid attention to this emulator. It never got properly spread around or tested the way it should have been. The dev was pretty full of himself, and from the very first contacts it was already clear he'd be a problematic guy. In one of the few times I asked about the project's future, he'd already told me Eden wasn't going the way the community expected, and that Sumi was coming to replace it. That never even came close to happening, and the emulator just vanished. Today you can't find any new versions, the repository went down, and the Discord disappeared right along with it. Pine was another Skyline-based emulator, exclusive to Android, and it's another one that barely deserved my time here. I looked for recent information about it, but everything's gone. Pine was a Skyline port, except it somehow managed to do everything worse. Games that ran fine on Skyline didn't perform the same way on Pine, compatibility was worse, everything overall was weaker. I remember that, during my tests, my device actually shut down a few times from overheating, even while using an external cooler, and not just any cooler, a Peltier cooler that could bring the outside temperature down to around 8 degrees. So here's the mention, Pine disappeared without most people even knowing about it. In the first few weeks after Yuzu got taken down, a few new emulators showed up trying to protect themselves from the same fate. That's basically what NXEMU does today, and there's also another project I still can't talk about publicly. But the first one that got popular with that idea was Nozomi. Besides running on HLE, meaning high-level emulation, Nozomi claimed it would be the first emulator to work without key files and firmware. When I first heard that, I honestly thought there was no way this guy would need 10 years to pull that off. And today we already have NXEMU running practically 50% of the games we've tested. Unfortunately, no build of Nozomi ever came out, and the last updates to its repository were about 2 or 3 years ago. At this point we can consider it dead. Now let's get into the honorable mentions. A while back I made a video titled Strato Promised a Lot and Delivered Nothing, and that ended up being one of the videos that caused me the most trouble on this channel. In it, I showed a compiled build of Strato that, if I remember right, had been made by Mr. Purple and shared around. Strato had promised to be Skyline's successor, but reality turned out a bit different. At the time, people had put all their hopes into it, and most of them criticized me hard for that video. It only got around 70% likes, honestly one of the worst numbers this channel's ever had. But it was honest, just like all my other videos. The Strato crowd threw a massive fit, especially on Sujano's Discord. Anyway, the video ended up getting deleted. I made a public apology. But what about Strato? Still no build, to this day. The videos showing off the emulator's so-called progress, besides not being very honest, since they only showed the lightest, earliest sections of certain games, just stopped coming out altogether, and almost nobody even remembers this emulator still exists. It's technically still active, you can occasionally see some changes to the code, but that's about it. Only the devs themselves actually have access. And, as a last mention, let's talk about Eden. As much as a lot of you are going to say you can run most games on it, ever since the emulator's 1-year anniversary, it hasn't released a single stable version. And the last one that came out brought a bunch of compatibility issues and broke a lot of stuff, especially for people with AMD GPUs. Even so, I still think it's the best emulator out there right now, especially for Android. The thing is, there are a lot of reports about AI abuse in the development process and personal issues between the devs and other projects. Nobody really knows for sure what's going on in there. It's one of the few emulators where a lot of people still have problems with Pokemon Legends ZA and also Tomodachi Life. Version 2.1 came out to fix the problems from 2.0, which had a lot of instability and broke a lot of things for users with AMD GPUs. So it was basically one problematic version trying to fix another one, and from what it looks like, the problem still hasn't actually been solved, since the last update on the master branch was made more than 45 days ago. Writing a changelog has pretty much always been a luxury over there. Sometimes all you get is Vulkan improvements, and you never know if that actually brought better performance, or broke something else even more. What do you guys think about this? Is Eden going through some kind of development trouble? Let me know in the comments. And that's this week's video. Before I wrap up, I want to give a special thank you to the channel's members and patrons. We're going to put all of you up on screen forever, as a way of saying thanks for being part of this project. Thanks for watching, see you in the next video, and I'm out.